All right, welcome to an interview with Michael Simons from Neo4j. And in this interview, we're going to talk about all things Neo4j OGM with Quarkus. Because if you followed some of my content, you might have seen that I did quite some stuff with Java and Neo4j and Quarkus and OGM specifically. And yeah, Michael has a few things to say about that because, of course, he also created a very cool extension where we can talk about that. So first of all, welcome, Michael, and it's great that you can join us today.
Thank you, Sebastian, for having me on your YouTube channel. Much appreciated. Sebastian already told a couple of things about me. I work for Neo4j. I'm one of two maintainers of the Neo4j OGM project, which used to be the backend for Spring Data Neo4j. We rewrote Spring Data Neo4j to be used without the underlying OGM, but that OGM code is still maintained, and we will keep on continuing maintaining it in the future. And yeah, many folks, among them our customers, started to use Quarkus. And what started off as a pure driver extension for Quarkus is now a driver extension. That means it's the basic connectivity to be able to connect from Quarkus to a Neo4j single instance, to a cluster, or to a cloud-hosted instance. And on top of that, we have now the OGM object graph mapper ready to be used in Quarkus out of the box.
Perfect. So I will just share a little bit of code, or first of all, the screen with the repo so that folks can see. So of course, we will provide links to all that. So that's basically, for now, the repository that we have here with on GitHub. You know, that's your repository, Neo4j OGM Quarkus. So that's basically the starting point, right? Or one of the starting points that folks can use if they want to use Neo4j OGM inside Quarkus, correct?
That's absolutely correct. I personally would say the starting point for Neo4j and Quarkus is basically code.quarkus.io, in which you can choose the official Neo4j connectivity or driver extension to OGM, and then you can add additional dependencies to it. We learned from the past that our goal should be to make this as close to bricks as possible, like not like a brick device, but more like Lego bricks, so that you can just pick and choose what you want to do with. So we made it easy to just use the connectivity and then add on top several other extensions. That one here lives right now under my personal namespace. Our goal is to have it in some point in the near future in the Quarkiverse, parallel to the pure connectivity extension. And we're working on that very closely with Red Hat.
Perfect. Yes. And I want to talk about that a little bit more in detail, because you also mentioned the Quarkus support of Neo4j more or less that already exists, like with the driver. Yes. And I've been using that in a project of mine that I also recently enhanced for a presentation called Favorite Coffee, which I've opened here, so which we can talk about with regards to the code integration. Yes. And just recently, I've included your project here, what you can see for folks, and then we can actually go into that, because that also has the dependencies on, on a few things here, Neo4j. So first of all, I think for folks, it might be interesting if you point out quickly the difference between this official Quarkus Neo4j integration and the OGM, world.
Sure. So the connectivity, or the official Quarkus Neo4j extension visible at the top, line 16 and 17, is basically the necessary Quarkus plumbing code to integrate the Neo4j Java driver with Quarkus. So you can imagine the Neo4j Java driver on the same layer as a JDBC driver, but for Neo4j. The plumbing we need to have in place, for example, contains configurational properties, so that you have external configuration in the form of properties files or environment variables, the thing that Quarkus developers usually expect from the framework. We have our own namespace there, so that you can put just those properties in your application and we figure out the rest. The plumbing then goes in and provides all the necessary conversion from the properties into objects that we can read and deal with, and provide eventually our driver as a kind of CDI being injectable in your project. So that's the basic connectivity layer. Next on, so we're still looking not at the dependencies of Sebastian's project, but we are looking at the dependencies of OGM Quarkus. We find the OGM dependencies. Those are like the main thing here is OGM core, which contains the whole object mapping content. And then OGM is in theory be able to be used with an embedded Neo4j database. We don't support that on Quarkus. We only support the bolt transport. Bolt is the internal or kind of external name for the Java driver as well. That's the name of the protocol actually. And we bring in that adapter. So, and as an end user or end developer, what Sebastian is in our case, that's the runtime view of what that favorite coffee project depends on, right? With the Quarkus Maven plugin, it's probably visible if you scroll down in your project in the build settings, exactly that one. That figures out what runtime dependencies are there. And matching to those runtime dependencies, we will bring in the necessary build time dependencies, not only for Neo4j stuff and OGM stuff, but also for all the other things you're using. For example, I've seen JSON mapping, we've seen REST and a couple of other things. That plugin brings all the build time dependencies. And this is basically where all the magic of the Quarkus OGM integration happens. So Neo4j OGM is a project living independently on its own at Neo4j and an official repository of us, and maintained completely independent. And it does a couple of things. It scans the class path for classes mapped, annotated with node or relationship. And yeah, perfect. That's a node entity. Has a couple of other annotations, for example, the ID attribute, has a couple of relationships. I mean, that's what Neo4j, a graph database, is all about eventually, about related things. And OGM uses this in a very reflective way. And we must make sure that this kind of reflection works in a framework like Quarkus that tries to avoid reflection as much as possible. So what the folks at Quarkus are doing, they are pushing many things that we are used to the build time, away from the runtime, so that you have these super fast startup times, for example, and the low memory pressure. And this is what the actually OGM Quarkus extension does. It does scan the class path while building your application for all the classes annotated with node entity or with relationship entity. It marks them to be included and to be available for reflection. It tells the build system to include these classes even when they are not directly used. And it creates a couple of index files so that they are also available if you're using the Graal VM to create a native image from your Quarkus application. That's basically the whole stack. At the bottom, we find the Bolt driver or the Java driver, low-level connectivity. On top sits OGM. We have two extensions for Quarkus. The first one makes the Java driver available to Quarkus. The second one massages OGM classes and infrastructure into Quarkus and actually picks the driver bean from the lower layer of the bricks and stuffs it into, we're going to see it later on, into the OGM session factory so that there's a connection available at hand.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think it's also interesting to point out the difference between Neo4j OGM, like this plain Java module, and then also now this extension that you created, right? Because some of my content, what I showed before, basically had not this module, but directly the Neo4j OGM and the Java dependencies, which also works. So, so this one gives you a little bit more of convenience. And maybe we can point out, the difference in using this basically a module that already like ships everything together. Also, the injection of a session factory, we can show this in a minute, to the just plain Neo4j OGM that you can use as a dependency, like pretty much similar to this one directly in your code, right?
Yes, but if you do so, you are obliged to pick the connection. So you can do two things, actually. You don't even have to depend on the Quarkus Neo4j extension itself. You can just bring in the driver and you can create the connection yourself. And to be honest, this is kind of a behavior we keep seeing in many support cases, actually. Not only Quarkus related, also Spring Boot related. And I think if I look long enough, I will probably find them in Helidon or Micronaut as well. So while there are tons of talks and what have you out there in this world, people still insist on creating connections on their own. I'm unsure if this is only Neo4j or if this happens also in the JDBC or relational world, but I've seen this over and over again, that people insist on reading their own properties with their own mechanism and do all those boilerplate we actually run for them. At a good day, I smile about that. At a bad day, I find this rather frustrating because there's a lot of effort into making the boilerplate, first of all, kind of invisible and actually works with the framework. All of these frameworks have certain, quirks is the wrong word, but specialities, how the runtime behaves and whatnot. And we try to get this right for all the customers, and so that we don't propagate the work across. So that's one thing people can and actually sadly do, making all of this manually. The next better step would bring in the OGM dependencies only and take the existing connectivity bean from the Quarkus context and stuff it into the session factory, and they are good to go. This works basically okay. It works the best when your entity classes are already registered for reflection in Quarkus. This happens when you return them from JAX-RS resources, for example. But if you don't do so, you might have unexpected results. And the biggest issue that we've seen in Quarkus is that our class loader, class path searching of entities might not always work. We use an excellent library to do so, which is called ClassGraph. The name is pure coincidence, nothing to do with our graph database, actually. We have quite some good experience with that library, but it needs to adapt to all kinds of class loaders out there. And let me tell you, those fancy class loaders like the Spring Boot DevTools class loader or the Quarkus Restart class loader or the Quarkus BuildTime class loader, they all have their specialties. And we are quite happy that we had a little layer of indirection between ClassGraph and OGM at that point, so that we can just use the Quarkus provided index when building things to figure out which classes are annotated like you showed before. So
okay, and this is also something that this particular extension does, right?
Exactly. So all those extensions have, during build time, the ability to look into a Quarkus provided index of annotated classes. You don't have to do anything to do this. This index is ready to use by an extension developer. And we can just say, give me all the entities annotated with what have you, at entity if you're using Hibernate, or at node entity if you're using OGM. So then we can prepare our mapping with that.
Okay, perfect. And then I think this might be especially interested for folks who already started playing around with Neo4j and OGM integration, because of the also some videos that I created, basically for folks to just get the full story here. What we have in this basic example is a JAX-RS class that exposes these, that then will be mapped via JSON. And then we have this bean, the coffee beans here, that injects a session factory. And now in that particular example, thanks to this new extension, that is already being provided. So we don't have to do anything. We can just write at inject session factory, which by the way is the OGM one. So from that package, which then will give you a session to interact with all of these things, and then automatically a load via the OGM in the OGM way. So all of that stuff is populated and works as expected. Now, I think the interesting thing is, first of all, for folks who just used the Neo4j OGM integration, then you need to provide a very thin wrapper to basically provide this class as a bean. So something like a CDI producer, which is quite easy, fair enough, with just some a scope that makes sense for you, either application scope or what have you. And then the question now is, so what the difference is to using that extension, right? So if I understand you correctly, if you expose these entities, like here there's a node entity, which now is the question, if I got that right, in Quarkus, is that already registered for a reflection, and is that basically already being usable? If not, and for those who tried OGM with Quarkus in the very early stage, maybe like 1 or 1.5 years ago, then sometimes you had to fiddle around with the indexes yourself or register manually all of these entities. And unless basically it's, if I understand this correctly, it's kind of like a coincidence that I say, I use this from a JAX-RS perspective. So it's it's registered for reflection because of the JSON-B binding automatically, or kind of like coincidentally, which is why it works with regards to that index in my application. Is that correct?
Yes, that's spot on. It's the same assumption I have. I quite sure it just worked coincidentally, so that all the fields are correctly populated and transported back. So with using that OGM Quarkus extension, we make sure all your node entities are correctly registered for reflection, are correctly registered to be available to the runtime class loader class path, and they also will be registered to GraalVM native image. That needs an additional step.
And just on that note, the GraalVM native compilation already works with OGM, also with Neo4j, correct?
It does if you do a couple of things manually. This manual things would include writing a couple of different annotations on your class as well. I think it's including native image, something. Quarkus provides a couple of manual plumbing itself, but I find it's much more natural to reduce the amount of annotations on your entities to a bare minimum, actually. So, and that's goes in the same direction what I said before. We know which constructs we require to be available in native image, which kind of we require default constructors to be available, and we acquire fields to be accessible. If not, we make them accessible. And this is all kinds of stuff that can actually be configured. For example, is the default constructor available by reflection in GraalVM native image? If you get this wrong, you will probably not notice during build time, but you will end up with nasty runtime errors, which I personally think are much worse than any build time errors.
Definitely.
So we make sure, and we have a fully integration test that includes running in JVM mode and native mode, actually.
Well, that sounds very good. Related to that, because I've seen as well and done it myself, that basically if you don't have this extension and or you would like to set up a session factory, like instantiate one yourself, is there any reasonable reason why you should do so? If you say you have some specifics that you would like to configure managing the connection yourself, do you have some like inset for that, or is the recommendation from you folks, if you can just use this extension and add inject, then you're good to go?
You are way more friendly than I am. I would say there is not a really good reason to do any manual plumbing here. So first of all settings regarding to the pure connection or connectivity layer, everything you can configure on the driver via some kind of configuration or settings can be done on properties. So you can adapt the connection lifetime, you can configure encryption. There's already a comment on line 6 if something should use an encrypted setting and whatnot. This can all be done via properties, and also the very little things that are actually configurable in OGM are able to be configured via properties. For example, the one in line 10, whether or not OGM should use native type. So OGM is actually quite an old module. It comes from a time in which Neo4j didn't have, for example, native date time support back in the days, or native spatial support. This is an extra dependency and extra setting that comes in that uses, so that it makes sure that dates are not converted to strings and stored as actual dates in the database, for example. So all of these things can be configured like this. Yes, and if you try to run this on a session factory yourself, then you're, for example, in danger to close the driver instance, right? If you set up the session factory yourself, it's something new session factory, then the package names of classes to be included, and then the driver that will give you a session factory that when it's closed, it will close down the underlying connection as well, which is most likely not what you want. Also, what's configurable in your application properties is, by the way, the packages to be scanned. So right now, OGM will look actually in the root package of your application, or actually in the root package of the class path, which is most likely also not what you want. You should probably configure that one.
Well, depends, right? I mean, depends on the project probably. If I say everything that's annotated with node entity, please take, or is there actually any reason why you would like to specify this further?
To reduce the number of classes scanned, actually. If you want to scan at the root level, please be my guest to scan the whole JDK.
Oh, okay, I see. That makes sense, but also it happens at build time, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you affect your build time probably, but not a runtime, right?
We affect the build time in Quarkus cases.
Okay. Well, yeah, fair enough.
Maybe it's on vice versa. Also, looking at our fault here, maybe there's some good default we can infer. Actually, I take this with me to figure out if I can. In Spring Boot, it's a bit easier because usually in Spring Boot you have one main application class that contains the main method. And usually all the scanning that happens in Spring Boot application starts at the package where this class is located. But in usually Quarkus application, you don't need a main file. You don't need a main class. You just drop a bunch of JAX resources or services, and they can be basically everywhere. But there's not necessarily a defined main entry point.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I think there should be a way to say in your project, just scan everything that is contained in this, like class compilation source. Because as far as I'm concerned, it should be the same for this for any other Quarkus bean or any other scanning for annotations, because they tell you if you include something. I don't want to say something incorrectly here on the recording, but I was really sure, or pretty sure, that if for CDI classes, it's the same. If you annotate a class, it has to reside in this code space and not, for example, in any other dependency. Otherwise, it wouldn't be taken. So I'm quite sure there should be a way to...
It's a good point, and it's also something I'm going to take away from this recording and probably comment on your YouTube later on. What happens if I just dump it in some other jar file? Not only in some, it's probably the index that Quarkus gives us only contains
Could be, yeah. And I think that would be a kind of okay limitation. If it doesn't work for another, I mean, fair enough. Then, you know, in the worst case, you have to like extend the index yourself. And as far as I know, you have to do this in Quarkus with other CDI stuff if you want to do so as well. But to your point, to make it more effective at build time, to only scan at what you're interested in, and especially not JDK classes or any other dependencies that you have, this would be interested to say, can I further optimize, or, you know, can you folks further optimize this way to just look at actually your application classes?
I'm fine to be on recording with that. So in a different framework, we would end up scanning the root class path. But as I said, we are using the Quarkus index to scan for stuff. We are seeing only what Quarkus shows us. So it's probably my task to fix our log warning message here, which is basically be careful, you're scanning the root path, which you basically don't. You're scanning only that snapshot view of the class path. So
also to see what's only included per default in that set of index.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, good to know.
Short derailment, but I think it was very valuable for us over here.
Yes, definitely. And it's also, it's interesting, and also for folks, because it's still, you know, like kind of like early support, or, you know, they might run into things with Quarkus, and it's always good to know kind of where to look at, I would say. Another thing related to transaction management, basically, I would like to hear your thoughts. I mean, first of all, you can comment on my code here and stuff like that. But basically, I think I have something. So what is your best practice to kind of like write transactions? I mean, nowadays I do mostly stuff like that because we don't have some out-of-the-box transaction support, right? I mean, you can comment on that as well, what the timeline is. But I usually have something like this, a method, or sometimes a static method with just that accepts some lambdas to run this and, you know, close and catch and all of that.
That's perfectly fine. So there's first of all, you did scroll very quickly. I've seen you're using a lot of custom queries, which is also completely fine. I'm totally in love that you're using the string literals. I can't do this at the moment because OGM still supports JDK 8, and so does Spring Data Neo4j. We will get to something more modern in the near future, but I'm still kind of jealous on being able to do this, which is nice. Yes, transactions. That's really an OGM deep dive. So the session factory is the long-lived object that gives you sessions. And a session is like a default Hibernate, a very, very context-heavy object. It maintains a cache or a state of objects that went passed through the session. So first of all, to not run into quirks with OGM is to make sure you, if you manipulate objects in one session, use the same session to save them and keep the session along as long as you manipulate the objects. If you don't do anything explicitly, like with your run-in transaction, then the lifetime of that session object is actually the transaction boundary, and we will figure things out for you. You can manually open and close transactions like you do in that helper method here. That helps you in cases in which the session or the internal state of the session grows, right? If you commit and close the transaction like this, it's basically the same as flushing Hibernate, writing out the cache, writing out the state, and getting a clean state, right? So that's the current state of affairs. I don't have any other word for state right now. We have been looking into a couple of options to make this a bit more declarative. So while we have tons of knowledge in our team about how Spring Data transactions or declarative transactions work, we don't have the same level of knowledge on declarative transactions in Quarkus. So when I say declarative transactions, I mean just slapping one add transaction or add transaction annotation on the method and things happen by magic. We looked into JTA transaction support in Quarkus, but I figured I need about a year to read the whole full specification about that to create integration that's really rock solid. And I don't have that full year to do this. So that's probably out of scope for the time being. Mm-hmm. Right now, we have an experimental branch or a research and development branch to see if we can support Panache. It's an extension on Hibernate in Quarkus, but it's also possible to run Panache extensions for other data stores. The Mongo folks already have this in their Quarkus integration, and we're looking into that as well. So what that would give you is like, Panache deals usually with data access objects, can be seen as repositories, whatever you call them, which do the transaction management for you, and which also offer a way of declarative query methods. So you have in data access objects and you say, give me all the coffee beans by name, find all by name. We are looking actively into that topic right now.
Mm-hmm. So this would give you then also a different API than what currently the OGM gives you, right? Because then instead of what have we here, like load all, for example, then you would have something like the typical Panache repository way by find by ID or things like
exactly.
that.
The same dualism that you will see with Hibernate, entity manager on one hand, on coffee bean repository on the other hand, but only with OGM. So that's basically.
Would that give you transactional support, or would that solve the transactional thing, or is that yet again implemented by different Quarkus mechanism?
To make this so it doesn't give us declarative transactions, but at least for the repository methods and for the additional API to be provided, we basically need to have that run in transaction method ready to go. And correctly scope the session object, not only the session factory. So that's basically in German die halbe Miete, half the rent to pay to get proper scoping. That's the first important step to get the scoping.
Okay, so it's fair to say that for now, for the time being, what I've basically been doing is any sort of business method, quote unquote, that does stuff, that changes the state of the graph, would then just run in a transaction and then provided by some sort of, boilerplate method that you can write once per project and write it in a somewhat fashion that is then safe to commit and roll back.
Exactly.
And then just use that, correct?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, perfect. Awesome. No, this sounds good. I think that's most of the questions I had, or the specifics about the integration here. Other than that, are there any things from your perspective missing? Well, I mean, besides transaction, what we just talked about in the OGM support, or especially with your background in Spring, I would be interested, like, how do you kind of compare these two worlds, or the state of them as of today?
Thing is, being on record here, right? So we can diverge into a couple of questions here. First of all, you asked about timeline prior to the question about timeline of transactions, but in regarding where that extension lives. Right now, it has my name on it. It's not mine. It's basically a Neo4j project. It is a Neo4j project. It's done in my working hours, but it should move into the Quarkus Quarkiverse. So that's the first step we have on our to-do list. That's the first goal we have for after the Easter holidays. So that was the question about timeline. With regards of frameworks, it gets more interested, more convoluted, or more complicated. I don't know. Back in 2019, 2020, when all that reactive story started, reactive programming and what have you, we wanted at some point really to be also first-class citizen of reactive support in Spring. That turned out to be really not only hard, but close to impossible.
In Spring, you say, so not just with the Java support with regards to some RX classes, but like
our driver these days is fully reactive possible. The driver itself can give you asynchronous methods, so you can do everything asynchronously or reactive. So that's the pure connection layer. But OGM on its own, it's from my current perspective impossible to do in a reactive fashion. So to have reactive proper, you first of all need back pressure support and being able to throttle the amount of data you get into. That works directly against how OGM works. OGM basically has a local subgraph of the graph in your Neo4j graph database. So to make this graph work proper, you have to get the whole thing over the wire into the application. And then you could, in theory, stream the entities from that subgraph. But what's the point of it? You want to be able to have back pressure on the wire, not somewhere in your application and pretend you have the fancy pants on and you do reactive stuff in your application. It's probably, it's bound to be
it's not the point.
Disappointing at some point, right? And with that in mind, we rewrote Spring Data Neo4j starting in 2019 without that OGM support. Spring Data Neo4j 6 these days works completely different than OGM. It does stuff record-wise, really different approach. So it's totally different thing. We are not going to have that with OGM anytime soon, and we are not going to add it to OGM. It's an option these days. If you want to have Spring Data repositories, then you please go with Spring Boot. It's an excellent framework. I love it. Spring Data Neo4j, it's excellent. Just pick the one thing that provides what you need in the end. If you really want or need reactive programming from back to start, use Spring Data Neo4j reactive repositories, you're good to go. If you're happy.
But that also means that as a Spring developer, you basically have to choose whether you want to go the OGM way and have this all in, like nicely manageable Java objects, or the reactive way. But then it's like an either or also in that world, right?
Yes. So Spring Data Neo4j 6, the current version, has blocking imperative and reactive repositories alike with the same underlying mechanism. OGM is out there. If you want to use OGM, you can have the same setup like we have now with Quarkus. It's basically what we started, what you ask about, set up the session factory of OGM yourself. It's still perfectly possible. And if you do this, it's actually quite easy to move from Spring Boot to Quarkus or back. I have a repository in my GitHub that has a couple of examples how to use Neo4j on the JVM. And the Quarkus example, the JAX-RS code, the OGM code is essentially or literally the same code as with Spring Boot and OGM without Spring Data. You can take the same classes, move them over. You can also take them to Helidon, MP, or to, no, not to Micronaut. Micronaut is different, but you can take them to something that has some microprofile support, for example. It's the same. Yeah.
Okay, so but for reactive and then, like the difference to like Spring and Quarkus, so that's not something that is, as I understand, also now on the timeline, like to have a similar thing in the Quarkus world, unless you want to like basically write it yourself on top of the driver directly.
So we are going to a bit uncharted territory for me here as well. As far as I understand Quarkus these days, especially Quarkus 2.8, I think it has been officially released this week, is reactive right from the start. But mainly, or first of all, invisible to the eye. It's not like in your face, here are the reactive types and a gazillion reactive operators to deal with. but it has a reactive infrastructure. You can still deal with your standard JAX-RS resources, and you're good to go, and you never notice you have a reactive infrastructure underneath. You can still have reactive endpoints with reactive types and operators, but you don't need to see them all the time. So, and if I move away from a library developer to a business developer, so sorry, there's the ice cream man outside there. If you notice this on the recording, it was irritating as hell. If I move from library perspective to a business perspective, I would again think twice if I want to mess with the reactive types everywhere in my domain. I think there is a couple of use cases, but they come like everything with pros and cons, and the cons on the reactive types are definitely the increased complexity to deal with things. And if you can avoid it by all means, and do something you can reason, you can more easily reason about.
Yeah,
that
no,
would
makes
be
sense.
my recommendation.
Fair enough.
It's not like they say do something pragmatic, but you need to be able to be reason about the workflows. So you're trying to model and to the workflows and workloads in the application. Yeah.
So if I understand that correctly, if anything, if folks have a valid use case for that particular, let's say, like reactive approach with Neo4j, then the best would be to either look into like a small self-contained Spring example or trying that out. Yeah. And or look then in the Quarkus world and see if you then manually can build something alike, yourself on top of the driver, or just, like go with a
that
separate,
would be one
service.
option. Or you can also stream. You can create reactive types and with the Mutiny framework in Quarkus, also from suppliers or from futures, and you can easily wrap your OGM code into that and see if you can model your workflow and workload accordingly. That would be a completely fair approach.
Well, fair enough.
I've seen a different use case a while back. So that was an excellent conversation with a customer. They wanted for a dashboard application. They same reasoning about. They had for everything else in that application, the imperative blocking approach was good enough. It worked just perfectly fine. But for the dashboard, you have to go to the dashboard, you have a couple of spinners around there. The important thing here is that all those spinners get their data eventually. And the queries they had, they were really well parallelizable, so they didn't get them in their way. The solution to that approach was just it were like 5 or 6 actually generated OGM, in that case SDN queries, wrap them in completable futures, run them in the background, and they popped up eventually on the dashboard, and that was the correct solution for that use case. My first approach was, why you're not using directive repositories? And the answer was because it was not necessary to get the whole complexity into the thing just for that dashboard. And I really liked that approach. It's the correct approach.
Would that, by the way, also work with an OGM way if, for example, you have, I guess, like multiple sessions in parallel, or do you then have some issues that you need to take into consideration?
I would work this with multiple sessions, actually.
Yeah. So, I mean, that would be my first naive way. Yeah. If you say, okay, have some sort of either completable feature or some, like managed executor that then just, does this in parallel and then put it together at the end. So then you have, what have you, like 5, 10, I don't know.
If you work with 5 or 10 sessions, maybe this or that object will be loaded twice. Right? Or
well, fair enough if it's, isolated. And
exactly. It will be isolated. It will be different object, maybe pointing to the same thing in a database. That is most likely to happen. If you keep it in one session, then this will not happen. Yeah. But maybe you will have some kind of locking in it. Depends on your query.
Yeah. No, that sounds fair.
But it was a super valid approach, and I think would work the same way in Quarkus and OGM.
Yeah, no,
And
definitely.
we're leaving basically our conversation about OGM and Quarkus at this point. Actually, it's more about what's easy to reason about, what satisfies a use case or a business case, and that's
and
eventually
Java in
much
general.
more important for people out there than. It depends if you want to do conference or CV like architecture, then get all the fancy things, but eventually you want to solve problems.
Yeah, no, definitely. But that's also, that's what I really liked about Neo OGM to begin with, because it really, gives you a lot of stuff out of the box. And especially what I liked is that it just auto, populates all of your classes if you have the specific relationship or whatever in the result set. So, you don't have to like do all of the setting yourself. If you just write, if you have like your custom query, and if you write a return correctly, then all of that stuff is populated and just works, which I think is just really cool and helpful.
It's thank you for that. Too much honor for myself, actually. That mapping code was there when I already joined Neo4j. So great work by the original authors. And brilliant example on how developers, in this case, my colleagues, maybe looked at things through the wrong glasses. This is a quality you enjoy very much, that you can basically throw any query on it, shaped in any way or form, and the OGM is able to figure things out for you. Yeah. We developed SDN, the new SDN, Spring Data Neo4j, with a kind of different approach. We had reactive workflows and record-based workflows in mind, and not so much picking the right things from arbitrary wild queries. And we learned it kind of the hard way. So with a couple of not so happy users, and that was an interesting takeaway. You have that one specific thing in mind, what you want to do, and you don't realize the number of custom queries people have in mind. And I find this quite staggering. It's lastly, it resonates with my talks I've given in the past about object mapping, SQL, and what have you. People actually want to use the database they paid for. They want to use the good query functions, being it SQL or Cypher, whatever. Should have listened to my talks in this case a bit more, so that there's the opportunity to run the queries and stuff and map it very widely. Anyway,
I think
could go ramble on for like conference talk, actually.
Yeah, no, fair enough. I mean, I can only talk from a user perspective, but certainly from a user perspective, this is really helpful, right? This is also to say, like, again, same with this declarative mindset of programming, is to say, okay, it won't be, like perfect from a performance point of view, right? For example, because then if I want perfect performance, anything, I have to write everything myself from scratch, right? And then it will just perform perfectly for what I want to do. But then the point also of these declarative approaches and an OGM mapping framework is to say, okay, it's just very pragmatic and productive. That's what I wanted to say with regards to that, what you say, like solve problems, where I think especially OGM is just a very good way to go, because I can write my Java class, throw a bunch of annotations on it, and whether it's, the quite perfect way or not, but it will just like work for what I want to do with interacting with my graph. And I think that's just, that's very, very pragmatic and productive way to go.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, let's close on a few words from you with Spring and Quarkus. I mean, I know you're mostly a Spring person, I think, still, or are you? And
I'm first and foremost, I think, a Neo4j person, actually. Okay. I love the company, I love the product we provide, and we have a couple of excellent stuff coming up in the future to come. That's my first goal, to make our product as usable as possible in many different ecosystems out there.
Fair enough. No, but basically my question was just what is your your experience now with what you've seen in Quarkus? Like, are there any things you like? What do you think is like, works better, works worse? Like, with regards to Spring, or just because as I understood it, it's also kind of like new for you, right? Like to be more involved in that world. And I would just like to hear your.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, yeah, well, what it brought for me was, first of all, very good and deep view into native image, into GraalVM, and what is necessary to make stuff shine on GraalVM. That was a really nice entry point. In the end, GraalVM is much more than just native image. It's also polyglot programming, which I do find spectacular, what is possible there. About Quarkus itself, I find again, it's a very pragmatic approach what we have there for library developers on the tooling, what is necessary to make this build time optimization. It just works. It's a kind of mixture between declarative and programming. Works very well for me. I was able to provide the OGM integration. There's another project of mine, in this case, Neo4j migrations. So database refactorings, also with the Quarkus integration. I like that tooling that is there for library developers. What Quarkus brought for me as an end developer is actually, if you would have asked me like 2 years or 3 years ago, what I like more, Spring MVC or JAX-RS, I would always say Spring MVC, because I used to do a lot of Spring MVC. But figures that JAX-RS is quite neat if you plug it into a runtime like Quarkus. So I can have clean JAX-RS classes without the need for field injection and stuff like that. They look like normal Java classes, are essentially testable like normal Java classes if I take the Quarkus flavor. So I'm really a fan of that. Adding on top of that, what I find is the Qt template language. So I'm old. Like I predate the fancy JavaScript frameworks. I still do server-side rendering with whatever is there. And I think Qt is a really nice way of doing things in Quarkus. And it's also started spreading. You find Qt templates and stuff like JMang for templates for generating Java classes. So yeah, that's 2 things I like on Quarkus. Also, I'm a big fan of the Quarkiverse. So that is the repository for providing extensions that are not in the Quarkus core. That's it's a lightweight approach to extend Quarkus without the need to build that fairly huge core project. So it's cool stuff.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. I think especially for Quarkus developers themselves, right? Like to just build this in an easier way. I think most most end users won't really like notice much difference, like basically you have a different group ID or something.
Exactly, or different selection box on the generator, but for providers and vendors, it's excellent stuff to have this.
Oh, sounds good.
Would I rewrite my existing Spring Boot applications I'm actually using? No, I don't think so. Why should I? There's no need. The stuff I'm using is well maintained and excellent stuff. Did I write a couple of actually production Quarkus application in the last 6 to 12 months? Yes, I did, and I'm a fan of that. Would do so again. Especially, I mean, it's small stuff I'm using for myself, and I can just dump it on Heroku. It can use the private or even the micro instances or whatever they're called for free. They wake up fast enough for my taste, or also for demoing and using it. And it just works just the way it should be.
Do you use that with the JVM mode or also native?
With JVM mode, actually.
Yeah, same here. I think actually all of my Quarkus production applications are in JVM mode, which I find also quite interesting. So for me, the whole build time optimization for me, it's almost like a side effect, that you can run things natively. I mean, it isn't, because that was kind of like the point, but it is a side effect in such a way that you say, even if you run it in a JVM mode, you get all of the advantages because you don't have this runtime reflection and stuff that you need to do. And, as you say, it's like
one thing that is often overlooked in JVM mode, and I mean, it's essential for people providing Docker images, is that you don't default to fetch jars anymore with Quarkus. You get the runner and you get basically a well-structured set of things, and you can build your Docker file in layers, which is quite neat. Or if you're really, really old school, you can just rsync the changed files to somewhere and restart the service. For example, that's quite nice.
Yeah, I like what you say about the layered approach, because that was basically my selling point for the enterprise Java world in since 2017 or so, when I gave talks with back then Java EE, to say why I like to run this with Docker.
Mean, that's eventually we all going in circles in the industry. Yeah. Spring Boot started with the fat jar, make jar not war approach. It was really a solution to a problem back then. It's really nice to be able to have a ready-to-use runnable jar file. You can dump it in some provider's service, and it's fine. But also Spring changed their build setup. You can basically create a really neatly layered Docker image with Spring out of the box as well. So we're going in circles. And I think, or not necessarily in circles, but innovation keeps on coming in. So we have now both possibilities in Spring Boot. We have both possibilities in Quarkus as well. And that's a good thing to have, because again, I can optimize for the need I have, or for the where I want to.
Yeah, and it's only, I recently saw I think it was a meme or something, where you say it looks like you're going in circles, but if you look from a 3D perspective, you're going like this, like a spiral up. So
that's beautiful. Yes, yeah, it's a beautiful image to have. Yeah.
So perfect. No, I think we can close with that. So where can people find you, or what's a good way to connect with you?
I'm Michael-Simons on GitHub, or on Rottenroll666 on Twitter. So, but if you go to my GitHub, I actually, 2 years late to the party, I added a README for my stuff on GitHub.
Nice.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Perfect, Michael. So thanks a lot for this very interesting interview. And yeah, for everybody watching, thanks a lot for watching.
Yeah, thank you from my side as well. And see you somewhere online. Thanks.
Right. Bye-bye.
Bye.